Okay, so today we will continue looking at the civil rights, and we'll continue to look at origin, tactics, and organizations. And so I do want to give you a good chunk of the class period to work on it. But I do want to, every day, you know, I keep focusing on an element of it. And so here I do have a clip here about one of the individuals that's being spotlighted. He's brought into it. They'll bring in some other issues as well, maybe another character that's part of the early movement, and the importance of agitation through the court system, which is going to kind of lead us into our next activity as well that will start another day. But here, Charles Hamilton Houston. When we think of like leaders, civil rights leaders who make a mark through the courts, sometimes we think of Thurgood Marshall, who eventually, he's the Brown versus Board of Education lawyer. Eventually he gets on the US Supreme Court in 1967. But in many ways, his mentor is Charles Hamilton Houston. And so kind of get a little bit of sense of who he is, kind of helps give us that context of how and why they are using the courts as an important avenue for change. So here we go. Got a little clip here, so let's follow along with that. Should be about 7 minutes here. Yeah, a little over 7 minutes. So focus on that. And then see.
For 20 years, the NAACP had been crusading against lynching. Now, after years of lobbying, protests, and marching, support for a federal law slowly gained momentum. By 1938, 70% of Americans expressed support for an anti-lynching bill. For Walter White, it was time to increase pressure on Congress.
The same arguments that were made by Southern Dixiecrats and senators then are the same arguments you hear now. No, this is going to empower the federal government. It's got to be states' rights. You're taking away the autonomy of the states. The 11th Amendment, states and individuals have to be protected from this kind of federal intrusion. Don't take away our states' rights.
Walter White, not having any luck with senators on the fence, goes to Eleanor Roosevelt and says, you got to help me here. You got to get the president to speak out on this. But I think that Walter really confused being near people with power with having access to power himself. And ultimately, he was disappointed time and again when Franklin Roosevelt wouldn't come through with his promises, when Eleanor Roosevelt, who was extraordinarily influential, couldn't deliver.
The president was frankly unwilling to challenge the Southern leadership. I did not choose the tools with which I must work, he told me. If I come out for the anti-lynching bill, they will block every bill I ask Congress to pass. I just can't take that risk. Walter White.
When the federal anti-lynching bill is put before Congress in 1938, it is filibustered to death.
Walter White would have continued to fight for an anti-lynching law in perpetuity, but for Charles Houston's arguments that the law is never going to pass, don't be so focused on this particular campaign, look at how the NAACP could grow in other areas.
Charles Houston wanted to emphasize to Walter White that there was already civil rights legislation and law available. Officers of the law were not supposed to subject persons to loss of life or deprivation of rights. It is a matter of the lives of African Americans being valued.
Houston knew that the Constitution, properly understood and rightly applied, would give Black Americans the freedom they were fighting for. So he took the fight to the courts.
My grandfather saw the courts as the ideal way to achieve equality, because if you fought that fight and you won, well, then it would be a legitimate victory, and it would be one that would be recognized by everyone. and would have the weight of authority behind it.
Their hope was to build towards some Supreme Court decisions that would begin to turn the tide and open the way towards challenging segregation in education. And so he had a strategy.
Charles Houston, having his training from Harvard Law School, understood that judges are not going to make decisions that will overturn rulings having to do with constitutional interpretation unless absolutely necessary. So it was Charles Houston who became the strategist and the architect for a campaign that would gradually dismantle the precedent of Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 separate but equal doctrine.
So they began to carefully pick cases that they would litigate, pick cases to win.
And cases that would establish precedent. Cases that, in Charles Houston's words, would make plain the inequality that existed in the educational opportunities of blacks and whites, and would make true equality too expensive for states to maintain. In 1936, Houston and his legal team would find a case with all the right components. Lloyd Gaines, a college graduate, had been denied entrance to the law school at the University of Missouri because of his race. Houston argued that Missouri was obligated to either build a law school for blacks equal to that of whites, or admit him to the University of Missouri.
Gaines became the first time when the United States Supreme Court was asked expressly, does a state have an obligation to provide professional education to people of color if there is no professional education available within that state? And the court said yes, and they ordered the University of Missouri to allow Lloyd Gaines to be admitted, and it was incredibly influential.
The Gaines case laid the groundwork for Houston's master plan. It would become the basis for the legal battles that would one day bring an end to legalized Jim Crow in America. But this one victory would not be enough for Charles Hamilton Houston. Over the years to come, Houston would pursue cases at every level, fighting against segregation in all aspects of American society.
He saw himself as a soldier who needed to work 20 hours a day, and he did so very, very often.
My grandfather had no tolerance for slackers or laziness or excuses. He believed in getting it done no matter the personal cost.
I think my father saw himself as a soldier, as a fighter in a long campaign against injustice. He did not stint in his hours or in his travel or in his legal preparation, despite the fact that his health was declining.
After suffering 2 heart attacks on April 22nd, 1950, Charles Hamilton Houston died.
My father, on his deathbed in the hospital, was given a book written by the attorney Louis Nizer entitled Peace of Mind, and that in the margin of one of the pages of that book, he inscribed to me the message, tell Bo, which was my pet name as a boy, that I did not run out on him, but that in every fight, some fall.
He died in 1950, so he wasn't around when the historic victories came to light. He wasn't visible during the civil rights movement, even during Brown, and because of that, he was, in too many quarters, largely forgotten. But make no mistake, he is the architect. He transformed the legal culture within this country. That kind of courage is essentially what transformed this country. Unless there were a handful of black folks who, after being beat down, were willing to stand up and say, my head is bloody but not bowed, it would not be possible to imagine change.
Okay, so in that little seven minute clip there, there's a lot of historical nuggets that I think that are important here. But if we look at what kind of takeaways can we get about Charles Hamilton Houston? What kind of takeaways? Anything that could possibly contribute to what we are looking at? from Charles Hamilton Hughes. Either at home or here. What do we got? What's the strategy?
Taking selective court cases to help push for certain things.
Okay, but ultimately, to push for certain things, in order for that to happen, it has to get to where? The Supreme Court. So you got to have these test cases. It's the only way it's going to make it up to the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court, in many, when we look at jurisdiction, it has what we call appellate jurisdiction, which means through appeals. You're appealing to the next court, and it has to go through that system. And eventually it does get on the docket. You know, the Supreme Court has tremendous power. It can determine which cases it wants to hear or not. And thousands of cases are submitted to the Supreme Court every year, and they get to select a few. I mean, that's the type of power and influence that they have. And so he realizes he's going to have to get these test cases out there. And when we look at his strategy, he is going to have some success. And that becomes that formula. But now, as it pointed out in the video clip, he set the foundation. He kind of set the formula in motion, but he doesn't necessarily get to see the full results of it, which we look at some big, giant cases that occur after 1950. Big stuff there. They mentioned a few words in there that still that are thrown around today a lot. Filibuster. Now, that's been mentioned in the news recently about filibuster. That's something in the Senate, not in the House. And this is where the party in minority or party in general, if they want to oppose a law, they can filibuster. Just basically means kind of stall it, talk it to death in many ways. And sometimes that filibuster may not even be related to the bill that's being proposed. And so you would see cases or laws that are being proposed that could take on issues like civil rights being filibustered. And so they mentioned that. They also mentioned a group of politicians known as Dixiecrats. Dixiecrats. What does that sound like? What's that? Sounds like Democrats, and they are from where? From the South, because Dixie references the South. So these are Southern Democrats. They are conservative Democrats, and they are unapologetically segregationists. So you'll hear about the Dixiecrats and how the Dixiecrats can stall civil rights initiatives just through their influence that they have inside the Democratic Party. And they will become eventually a powerful voice that by 1948, they will actually have a candidate that would oppose the re-election of President Harry Truman, who is a Democrat. Not enough votes, electoral votes to prevent Truman from getting re-elected, but enough to take away from the Republican and enough to kind of scare Harry Truman. Eventually, these Dixiecrats will leave the Democratic Party in the 1960s. They will leave the Democratic Party and they will join the Republican Party as that party becomes more and more conservative. So the conservative Democrats that are the Dixiecrats, they will eventually leave. So that term was being mentioned, and that's something that we'll come back to as we continue to look at this. And then when you think about, you know, that early education case, it wasn't about primary or secondary education. It was about graduate work. It was about higher education. And so that they're being very purposeful in picking that case as well before they took on younger ones. They figure, let's go with the older student first and then work their way. So that's also part of the strategy. All right, huge. All right, any other thoughts on that? Okay, now in regards to this activity here, the newspaper that you're putting together is technically due when? Today, at what time? 11:59. All right, I can guarantee you I'm not going to be here at Park at 11:59, standing out front with the basket, collecting your newspapers. So what that means is, yeah, it's due at 11:59 tonight. And we're doing it on paper. I am going to be collecting it from you on Monday when you come in right away. That doesn't mean you're going to have all weekend to get it done, because guaranteed tomorrow we're having, well, I'm teaching during Flex Friday, so you need to log in, and we're going to move on to another topic, all right? And that topic is going to deal with the courts. So this video kind of is a good intro, and we'll build on that for tomorrow. So to recap, because you know I've been very talkative today, is that I will get your paper from you on Monday. All right. Does that give you a little bit more time? I suppose, yeah. But know that Messiah and I, we always have deadlines, and we got to get used to them, and that when we get to a deadline, there's going to be probably something else starting up. All right. So with that, do we have any questions? Any questions here at home? Well, if there are none, let's work on this. You have the rest of the class period to dedicate to this. If questions do happen, feel free to ask. Those at home, you can stay on or exit, and have a good day.